So welcome to our first lecture of the second topic, diversity in economics. Today's topic will be racism and colonialism in economics. Does economics need to be decolonized? Today we warmly welcome Ingrid Kvangraven. She's a heterodox development economist, and she has a Master of Science in Development Studies from the London School of Economics and a PhD in Economics from the New School in New York. She has taught at the University of York, and now she's an assistant professor at the King's College in London. She's also co-founder of the network called Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, and as part of that, we are very honored that you will speak today of the topic of decolonizing economics. And I will now hand over to you so that you can give your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So I think, yeah, there you go. Yeah. So I'll share my screen in a second. There we go. Yeah. So as you said, yeah, you introduced my title as something slightly different, but I will talk about racism as well in this talk. But I'll give a kind of foundational introduction of like how to think about economics as colonial, and then then discuss why that matters. And one of the reasons why that matters is because a colonized economics is also a racist economics, and we can talk more about that as well. So, and I'm turning on my timer now, so I'm sure that we get lots of time for Q&A towards the end. So have a think about your questions. You can put them in the chat or in the Q&A box while I'm talking as well. Oh, wow, that's very bright. Okay. So basically, I'll just start with the very basics. What does decolonizing economics mean? And in order to even kind of get to that question, I have to ask the question, like, has economics been colonized, and what does it mean that economics has been colonized? Because that's the foundational question. And then in order to then discuss what decolonizing economics means. And this is a debate about like decolonization in the social sciences. It's an old debate in the social sciences that was quite active in the humanities and some parts of the social sciences as well in the 70s and 80s. But it's kind of come late to economics. So economics is catching up, has a lot of catching up to do. But economics, especially the past couple of years, has had a lot more, there's been a lot more discussion. So that's great that you guys are also interested in decolonizing economics, because I do think it's very important. Yep, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and then why it matters, how it matters. And then very briefly, I just put a slide on what can we do, because I know you're a student organization, and a part of your work is also activism and thinking about change, right? So I put some preliminary thoughts on a final slide about that. So decolonizing economics, sorry to put so much text on the slide, but I'll break each of these points down in the following slides. So I just wanted to put some thoughts down for you to look at first, because there's a lot of different ways to think about decolonizing economics. So these are 5 ways that I think are important, but they're not the only ways. And so the first one that I'll talk about first is about colonization of economics as the erasure of colonialism in the way that the field depicts the development of capitalism. And I'll talk about why that matters, because that's kind of always assumed in the economics field, how capitalism evolved and what capitalism is. And it's often not explained. And colonialism is often just completely sort of not a part of it at all, which means that a very important part of the economy and how it works is lost. And then the second part is this upholding of Enlightenment values that I'll also go into in more detail, like universalism, essentialism, modernity, that are very foundational in the economics field. But again, never really talked about in economics, right? This is like a post-colonial analysis of the economics field, really. And then and these two next points have more to do with, I mean, they have to do with decolonization, but they also have to do with the diversity theme that this lecture series is a part of, which is this erasure of global South-centric views in the history of economic thought. So the problem of a very monolithic history of thought that leaves out a lot of the diversity of the actual history of thought. And the erasure of pluralism, which I know the Rethinking Economics community is very aware of, but including theories and scholars from the global South. And then finally, the erasure of power analysis generally in the economics field also has an implication for, or needs to be challenged in order to decolonize economics. So I'll go through these very quickly so that we have that as foundation, and then we can talk about why it matters, or how it matters for economics today. So if you think about how maybe you've never encountered the development of capitalism in an economics textbook, I don't know, like the most famous textbooks don't talk about it, but there are some, like some of you probably will be familiar with the Core textbook, which it was like the mainstream response to the financial crisis, and they do talk a little bit about the development of capitalism. But when it's encountered in economics in the mainstream, it's often depicted as this period of rationality and technological development, increases in productivity that happened during the Industrial Revolution in England. And this is seen as an endogenous process, right? Something that's happened in England, kind of confined to England. And alongside this economic process of increasing productivity, technology, there's also this kind of promise of freedom, increased freedom, liberty to pursue individual self-interest in the capitalist market, right? This is kind of the assumption that's very often made when the development of capitalism is talked about in the mainstream. When it's talked about, I mean, often it's not even talked about. So this means that the development of capitalism, when it's discussed, has no relationship to colonialism, the slave trade, or structural racism. So this is a problem. Yeah, I'll get to why that's a problem, but I wanted to say that because those things are completely absent from this depiction of the development of capitalism, it's laid this foundation for the way that we think about economics today as these standard laws. So this happened in England, capitalism developed in this endogenous way, technology improved, everyone became more rational, we had scientific developments. We can now kind of think about this view of capitalism as something that can be exported to the rest of the world. And we can use this view of capitalism to derive, laws of economics, principles of economics that we can assume function the same way across the world. And if they don't function the same way across the world, then that's like an aberration or imperfection that needs to be understood. But generally, the kind of foundational assumption is that things should operate more or less in the same way across social, political, historical contexts. So given that colonialism, the slave trade, are completely absent from this account, even though those processes were happening at the same time as the development of capitalism, this view is, of course, partial. It's just one view of how capitalism developed that leaves out very, very important debates about this development. And there's lots of literature and debates, mostly outside of the economics field, that challenge this, what they call Eurocentric view of the development of capitalism, because they're like scholars in the Black radical tradition in particular, look at how the slave trade provided lots of profits for English slave traders that were invested in the English economy that helped to kind of create the conditions for the development of capitalism that then happened later. So they're not completely separate processes. And of course, a lot of scholars have also pointed to the benefits to England from colonialism, and how also colonialism, while having an impact on the development of capitalism in England, also impacted how economies were shaped in the rest of the world, So you can't kind of assume that capitalism will function in the same way everywhere, because colonialism had a very differential impact on the colonizer and the colonized. So there, I just put a few books up if for further reading. So Eric Williams is one of the a very kind of famous scholar in the Black radical tradition, who wrote about how the slave trade impacted the development of capitalism. Walter Rodney kind of comes from more dependency theory tradition, but also engages with racism and economics as well, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And there's now Roji, who wrote kind of very early on about the colonial drain from India to England and how England benefited from colonizing India. I can share these slides later on if people want these references. So that's one aspect of the sort of the colonization of economics that leaves out everything that has to do with colonization in the way that the economy is depicted and the way that the development of capitalism is depicted. So now, just to go quickly to the next one, Enlightenment Values. So Enlightenment Values, I think I mentioned some at the beginning that were about rationality and modernity. So I just want to say quickly, like, what is modernity? Because I don't think that's necessarily obvious to a lot of economists. It's a term that's often just kind of thrown around. It's very often perceived as something that's normative. You want to be modern. You don't want to be backwards. You don't want to be savage. You know, that's kind of the opposite of modern. It includes a lot of things. It does include like a capitalist economy. So that's very relevant for economists and economics, but also things like a liberal democratic state and other kinds of institutions of public life. So for example, rule of law, for example, would be a very modern idea of modernity as well, to have that. And so during the Enlightenment, there was this dichotomy that was produced between the modern, capitalist, rational, objective, scientific, and the others, right? So Edward Said kind of famously talked about the Orientals in his Orientalism book, where it's seen that like the Europeans produce logic and science, and all the others produce myth, superstition, and non-scientific stuff. So this kind of view of European thinking versus other kinds of thinking can still be seen in the economics field today. And so because of this, Zain El-Abidine and Shara Sheila, who are two of the few economists that have written about, that have critiqued economics from a post-colonial view, they argue that the field itself is this hegemonic discourse of modernity. And the reason for this is partly because they see essentialism is also something in modernity where like you see everything as having like a certain essence, like for example, human nature is rational, for example. And you define, and you see that in economics that a lot of the way that things are described are often in terms of their essence. So human behavior, Homo economicus is supposed to act in a certain way. That's the essence of a human being, is Homo economicus. Markets are, function perfectly or imperfectly. That's the essence of competition. So this essentialism view of the economy is there in the field. And also another aspect is that and this is something that, even economists, mainstream economists also kind of criticize the field for being too abstract and for universalizing these principles that are often presented in, the Mankiw textbooks or wherever, which, we can talk about without, mentioning the Enlightenment or modernity or rationality, but they come from this, historically they come from the Enlightenment, or they were associated with the Enlightenment and this view of the world. And this is very important in the development field, the field of development economics, but I won't go into that now. So those are kind of some of so first of all, history of capitalism, kind of very big question, and then the kind of post-colonial critique of the economics field. So now I want to talk a little bit more about maybe some things that are more familiar to you in terms of, pluralism and rethinking economics. which has to do with how the history of thought is presented, and then how, there's a lack of pluralism generally. So as many of you know, history of economic ideas tends to very often start with Adam Smith. And very often it's the story of the invisible hand, where Adam Smith interprets capitalism to be the most beneficial way to organize human societies. So Adam Smith said a lot more than just this, right? He was also quite critical in some ways. But that's often the kind of first things that are introduced by Adam Smith in an economics textbook. But some of you may know Ibn Khaldun, who was this scholar who was writing centuries before Adam Smith. And he had a lot of the same insights, but it's completely erased from the history of thought. So the history of thought is partial, right? The official history of thought is partial. And of course, there are all these scholars that don't think of capitalism as kind of a very beneficial system, that are also kind of written out of the history of thought. And a lot of them come from the global south, like, for example, Nauroji, who I already mentioned, and Walter Rodney as well. So I just put an article here from Economics, which is kind of summarizes Ibn Khaldun's contribution to economics quite well. And so just to give you a bit of a flavor of what he said, well, basically he recognized the importance of the division of labor for productivity increases, which is something that very, very often is attributed to Smith, right? He also had other insights as well. But Smith basically kind of extended what Ibn Khaldun already had observed. So that's one example of, the history of economics, starting with the UK-based scholar and just erasing everything that came before from elsewhere. There's also a great paper by Eric Reinert, where he looks at the bestsellers of economics in the 1800s, the 17 and 1800s, and sees that actually most of the most sold economics books were not the ones by Smith and Mill, and Ricardo, but actually from other European economists were actually much more well known during the time. But the history of thought has been rewritten, right, to kind of this linear narrative where almost all the economists come from the UK, even though they weren't the most influential at the time that they were writing. So then to the fourth point, pluralism. As many as you know, the economics field has narrowed a lot, especially since the Cold War, to become much less plural than it was. And this papers over the fact that there are competing ways of studying the economy. As I mentioned before, textbooks often present principles of economics as if there are principles out there in the abstract rather than competing theories or competing principles, if you will. Very often student movements in Europe and the US tend to focus on the heterodox approaches that are also from Europe, right? So like Marxist economics or Keynesian, Austrian, if you will, feminist. But there are also lots of non-European or non-American economic theories and philosophies. For example, Ubuntu, which is a way of understanding human behavior that's very different from Homo economicus, which is like your behavior basically is impacted by your relation to others rather than like just internal to yourself. And Gwen Wivid is another one that I'm sure I saw there was a talk, I think after this one on post-development. So yeah, that person will probably talk more about Gwen Wivid. And presenting mainstream economics as a set of principles amounts to colonization because it denies space for these alternative ways of thinking about the world, in short. Finally, so kind of bringing a broader aspect into the way to think about colonization of economics. With this movement after the Cold War of the field becoming very monolithic, the field has also become depoliticized, has cloaked in this language, kind of what I talked about before with modernity and stuff. that economic theory is presented as very neutral, objective, rational, which conceals the power imbalances in the economics field itself, with heterodox economics basically marginalized and global South scholarship marginalized even more. So it conceals these battles within like knowledge production itself. And knowledge production, as we know, is ultimately political. It wasn't, I mean, often the history of thought is often presented as like, you know, a refinement of economic thinking throughout the past centuries, where we like arrive at the state that we are in today through this like process of like improving the field. But really it was, you know, much more a political change that happened that allowed sort of the mainstream to become much more dominant, or neoclassical to become mainstream, and Marxist to become heterodox. So that's a political question, and you cannot really have a neutral way of approaching the world. You're always theorizing in some way, right? So denying that is a form of colonization, because it excludes these power dynamics that are necessary in order to understand the colonization of economics, and also the colonization of the post-colonial world. And this is important because theorizing from outside of the former colonizers also yields kind of very important insights that I'll get back to in a second. And also the university itself has colonial roots, so that's something to also think about. We're all, well, many of us are associated with universities here. So in terms of thinking of what to do about this, we need to also kind of scrutinize and criticize the university itself, which is also political. So there's a book on this that I just put picture up here that you can have a look if you want, by Gurminder Brambra and others, an edited volume. So that was kind of a brief introduction to like 5 ways of thinking about how economics has been colonized. So with that in mind, what does decolonizing mean? So the first point would be, you know, in reaction to the first point that I mentioned, would be to acknowledge that the development of capitalism was founded on a violent, exploitative, colonial, and racist project, or at least acknowledge that those issues played a role in the debate about how capitalism evolved, which has implications for how we theorize about capitalist dynamics today. And I'll talk a bit about that as well, like what happens, how can you theorize, how does it change the way we theorize about the world today if we acknowledge these processes being interconnected to the development of capitalism. Another implication that relates to the second and third point about the global South scholarship and global South-centric scholarship being excluded. If we take that into account as a form of colonization, to decolonize then means to decenter the global North. So it's not about, you know, throwing the global North stuff in the trash and, you know, centering or like only teaching Ubuntu or something like that. It's about providing space for scholarship from the global South and scholarship that takes the global South as a starting point, and therefore making, you know, the global North less dominant, so decentering it. Also re-politicizing economic theory itself, recognizing how it's political, showing how, like, which assumptions are made, what are the theoretical foundations of the kinds of ways that we theorize and do empirical work, and also give more space for theories emerging from outside the global North. Okay, so that was the kind of abstract level. Hope you're still following me. So I'll talk a little bit more in concrete things now, like how does this matter? So there are 4 ways that it matters, I would argue. There's probably more that you can think about as well. I think one important lesson that we can draw from this kind of way of thinking about colonization of economics and decolonization of economics is about positionality. So where you theorize from matters. Someone theorizing from England in the 1800s is going to see the world differently from someone theorizing from Latin America in the 1800s. they have entirely different influences, and the world around them is very different. So that's a very kind of important first insight. To bring this not kind of beyond the just colonizer colonized, or about colonialism, you can, for example, see that like other marginalized identities also, if you theorize from other marginalized identities or vantage points, that will also bring different insights. For example, I brought in here feminist economics. So women, for example, there was a study a few years ago that showed that women economists are more likely to think that labor markets are discriminatory. So this kind of builds under the idea that, if you experience discrimination in some way, you're more likely to see that discrimination, and that'll impact the way if you are working on labor markets, you will, bring that into your work. So in that sense, linking back to the theme of the lecture series and diversity, having more diversity in the economics field can help improve economic theorizing. Sorry, it's an ambulance passing by. So having more diversity in the economics field can actually improve the field itself, just because there will be more people with more experiences that can see the world differently. It's not a given that women will always, see the world differently than men, and of course, men can also make important contributions to feminist economics. But being in a marginalized position makes it more likely that you see these forms of discrimination and these inequalities. Similarly, as I kind of alluded to before, scholars in the Global South are more likely to see the global economy as unequal, as polarizing. So there's a rich scholarship on dependency theory, for example, that I worked on a lot during my PhD and since then, which is a really rich body of literature that is probably the Latin American tradition is the most well-known, but there's also, there's Samir Amin in Africa, who's based in Senegal for large parts of his life, Furtado in Brazil, Cardoso in Brazil, and even like Naoroji, who I mentioned before, he wrote before dependency theory became a thing, but he was kind of theorizing about similar things, about how the global economy is hierarchical, how it's unequal, how it's polarizing, and that how, like, some key insights from dependency theory is that the colonial legacies matter for how the economy is structured, right? Which seems like a basic insight, but in the mainstream of the field, that's something that is very often neglected or an afterthought, or like put in like the subfield of economic history. But for dependency theories, that was key. Like, how could you talk about the economy in Brazil without considering how colonialism shaped the economy in certain ways, and how Brazil's position in the global economy in this hierarchical world actually impacts what it can even do and how it can develop. So that's an example of an insight that tended to come from the Global South. You can also have scholars in the Global North, of course, using dependency theory, but it's a much more active research program in the Global South. And then finally, going back to the race aspect as well, so the Black radical tradition is mostly made up of Black scholars, although white scholars also contribute to it. And there again, Black scholars are more likely to see the social construction of race historically and during the slave trade specifically, and basically also see how that has an impact today as well with racism. So therefore, with that perspective, it's easier to see structural racism. And I'll get back to in a second how that's different from how the economics field sees racism as something that isn't structural. So another implication is that policy debates become very narrow. So associated with the mainstream of the field, seen as objective and neutral, there's also this evidence-based policy narrative that's been prominent for the past decades, which is based on this methods-driven field. So critiquing this does not mean to say that evidence isn't important. Of course, evidence is super important. We have to look at, what's going on in the world, make sense of it, and, make empirical and theoretical arguments. But the evidence-based policy discourse privileges very few kinds of evidence, right? Which are based on mainstream methods, which excludes a lot of other kinds of methods. So I've written about this a little bit in terms of randomized control trials, which are pervasive in development economics, but also in the global north as well. Basically, randomized control trials allow you to ask very small questions where you can have a control, an experiment group, test a very specific policy, and then provide evidence for that policy. But it doesn't allow you to even engage with more structural questions of like, how should we change the structure of the education system or the legal system, or kind of more bigger questions like that, which are important in terms of if we want to tackle structural problems in society. Also, another implication in terms of policy is that the scholars in the global north tend to set the agenda and have a very shallow engagement with scholars in the global south. So the action point here then is to try to re-politicize these debates and bring in more alternative views and demonstrate how evidence-based all kinds of evidence is political in some way, because it's not produced in a vacuum, and it's taking certain assumptions and theories to produce, right? It's not a neutral activity. So that would improve public debate. So just a quote from Esther Duflo, who is very, very famous economist who won a Nobel a couple of years ago, who really is really pushing for this evidence-based agenda, and really pushing for small problems, small solutions to small problems. And she says, this is less depressing than the view that it is a big conspiracy against the poor. Name your favorite enemy, capitalism, corruption. Our view is easier. You think hard about the problems and you can solve them. That is why I feel generally a happy person, not at all discouraged. So that is kind of, and she's a very influential person in development economics in particular. But saying something like this basically forecloses or shuts down the debate about capitalism and corruption, so that we don't think about those. We only focus on the kind of very specific problems that we can solve, which is a form of colonization in a way, because it rejects the big structural questions about imperialism and the unequal impact of capitalism. So another way that this matters is that if we recognize the role of power in shaping economic outcomes, which was one of the 5 points I had at the beginning, if we recognize that, we can better understand the world, and it provides a better starting point for understanding how we can achieve change as well. And with power here, I had some, to not be too abstract, I put some examples: exploitation, imperialism, structural racism. So then back to my previous point about racism. Can we understand racism without understanding structural racism? So I did a survey with my collaborator, Serbi Kezar, last year, where we asked economists about how they teach economics. And one of the questions was whether what you teach allows you to also include issues of racialized inequalities or the role of European colonialism. And in the mainstream, less than 40% said that the way that they teach allows for this kind of understanding, whereas in the heterodox, it was higher, 87%. And then in the others, that's like economists who teach in political science or development studies departments, it's also much higher than the mainstream. So basically, a lot of mainstream economists are just saying that no, what I teach does not allow students to see either racialized inequalities or European colonialism. still mainstream economists do study racism, right? But they take an individualized approach to it. So they look at taste-based discrimination versus statistical discrimination, which probably some of you are familiar with those debates, where basically the argument is that racism is something that comes down to you as an individual, that you make certain racist calculations, either because you are racist or because you statistically calculate the average of the likelihood of a Black person having a certain education versus a white person. And then you make that statistical calculation and then you make a decision based on that likelihood, which is also racist. But yeah, those are the different ways of kind of thinking about racism in the mainstream. And the consequences of that is that if you see it as something individualized, you come up with individualized solutions. So during the Black Lives Matter protests last year and the killing of George Floyd, a lot of the policy solutions that were coming out from The Economist was about like body cams for police officers, rather than thinking about how to change the structure of policing, right? And also similarly, like, I mean, it's a very new debate now, but with the Rittenhouse trial that was just concluded a few days ago, a lot of people are, blaming that one judge who was, a Trump supporter, rather than seeing like the legal system as a, structurally racist system that allows people like the judge in the Rittenhouse trial to make a ruling about, this person who killed several Black people being innocent. So that is another way that it matters. Like if you erase power, you basically erase the possibility for understanding these structural problems. And that's a problem with how we understand racism. It's a problem with how we understand development. It's a problem with also with sexism that we can also talk more about if you want. And then another, I think this is my fourth point. I forgot to put the number there. But finally, the theories and insights that come from the margins, it's not just about that they help us understand what's going on in the periphery, in the global South better, but it can also help us understand the world better from a global North perspective. So Komarov and Komarov make this argument in their book, Theories from the South, where they say that actually a lot of the things that were global South scholars theorized about for a long time, austerity, inequality, labor informality, are now becoming very big problems to a greater extent in the global North. So we can actually benefit and learn from what the people in the global South have been theorizing about for a very long time. There was, like, for example, Guy Standing, who does a lot of work on labor, has recently said that informality in the labor sector is this new phenomenon that we need to grapple with. Whereas in the global South, of course, labor informality is something that is not at all a new phenomenon. It's been like the dominant form of labor for a very long time. And there are a lot of labor economists, from the global South that probably can give labor economists in the North a lot of insights. And same with dependency theory that I mentioned before. It's been taken up and applied to study the Eurozone and the sort of core periphery of the Eurozone and the inequalities that are produced there. So it's not like, the global South scholarship is just for the global South and the global North is, to understand the global North, actually having a more decolonized economics field can actually, help us understand the global North better as well. So that was the 4 points on how does that matter? And I'm sure there are others that we can talk about as well. So now the final slide is about what we can do. And I just have some very preliminary things, and I know there's a lot more that we can do than what I'm putting here, but they're just some thoughts. So creating the spaces for anti-colonial resistance is one. It's very abstract, like how can we do that? And that's something that we can think about in terms of every single institution that we're a part of is implicated in some way in the global system, right? So like our universities, for example, how can a university be anti-colonial is a question. And asking that question leads us to see also how our universities are implicated in different ways. For example, through partnerships with universities in the global south, or partnerships with researchers, who is being hired, and open access policies, so many different things that we can think about in terms of like acting in an anti-colonial way, which means, basically trying to see what are colonial practices that are going on, and how can we prevent them, how can we resist them. Speaking about academia, because I find myself in academia a lot, but there are also, within all of our different things that we do, right? Our gyms, or our NGOs, or our other civil society things that we're working on. Also think about ways to decolonize our everyday academic practices. So this can be like, there are small ways to stimulate change as well. Like think about how we chair meetings in a more inclusive way, so that voices that are often marginalized are also heard. Think of who we cite, who we invite to give talks, how we engage in meetings. Do we, elevate others, or are we, how we engage ourselves. Raising awareness is another big one. A lot of people simply don't know about sort of the ways that the global economy is colonial, or economics is colonial. So that could be through blogs, op-eds, social media, lecture series, debates, the arts, we many. Engaging with non-academic institutions as well. It's important. Policy institutions, civil society, people that are actually, more engaged with changing policy, activists, etc. Dialogue with the mainstream is another important one. There are different strategies, right? And we can talk more about that. And I know this, like the Rethinking Economics has this discussion a lot, like, what is the best thing to do? Is it just to present a lot of heterodox views and raise awareness about heterodoxy, or is it to try to confront the mainstream, change the mainstream? How do you best change the mainstream? But definitely the mainstream of the economics field is extremely powerful, and it has a lot of colonial and racist elements. So in order to change it, you also have to engage with it. And I invite you to think of other ways as well. So thank you very much. So I think I took about less than 45 minutes, so we should have more than enough time to have a discussion as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I think we all would be delighted to have your slides afterwards, so we can look into the literature that you proposed. And everyone is now welcome to post their questions in the F&A. Remember that we're recording this session, so if you don't want to pose your question live, you just write it to your question or post them anonymously. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself and then you can read out your question. Since I don't see any questions by now, I will pose a question first. My first question would be like, the field of economics itself is a construct that was made in the global north, and I was wondering, like, it isn't natural to have these disciplines, and economics was invented, I think, in the countries in the so-called global north. Do you think that as a discipline it can even be decolonized, or is it also some kind of colonization to say that other countries also need to have this discipline of economics?
That's a great question. I really like that question. And I think it's, first of all, it's a great point that economics is a construct, and before economics, it was political economy. And even Adam Smith was a political economist; he wasn't an economist. And it was something that happened later on in the 1900s, where the social sciences were split, and that kind of laid the foundation for this very kind of principles of economics approach, right? So I think that the things that I mentioned about like what you need to in order to decolonize economics, like introducing power, for example, that basically is a return back to political economy in some ways, because it's recognizing the social elements of the economy, which I think is necessary. So the question is whether we should like try to dismantle the actual field of economics itself and create something totally different. I think is it maybe depends on what kind of view you have in terms of like what temporal view you have. Is it's short term or like super long term. Because we have this discussion a lot in like discussion about heterodox economics as well. Because a lot of people are like, well, isn't it just political economy? Like, why would we call it economics at all? When trying to decolonize economics and accepting that economics is a field, it's engaging with that concept and kind of refusing to let economists monopolize the questions of economics. But so that's kind of it's a reaction. But I see your point that if we really want to have a like properly anti-colonial way of approaching economics, we can't just, like, economics is too restricting. We need to also think about other social sciences and how they're embedded, how economics is embedded in like the social and political, institutional, legal, all that stuff. So I think that's something to strive towards. But then in order to engage with the field itself, if we already at this point start to say, well, we're not doing economics, we think economics is a colonial construct that we don't want to engage with, then we're kind of not even engaging with economists themselves. So we're dismissing ourselves from the discussion, I guess, engagement with the field. But it's really something to think about, and I do think it's definitely something that has been transplanted from the north to the south. There's this great paper by Howard Steen that came out earlier this year, where he traces how, like, the role of, and it's not even colonialism in the formal sense, it's through structural adjustments. So it's like contemporary ways of shaping institutions in the global south. And he looks at how structural adjustment led to more neoclassical universities in African countries in particular, and setting up with economics departments and how they were very ideological, which of course is a very kind of imperialist thing to do. Samira Amin, who's an African economist, was also like, primarily in a way like the way that you're describing, and not economics economist. And he was never, he never engaged with economics departments per se. He was much more engaged with like the social sciences institutions. But what he did was political economy basically. And economics, I would try to claim him as a heterodox economist, but different fields have tried to claim him, I guess history as well, and sociology.
Okay, thank you much for this answer. And we already have one comment. Thanks for your interesting talk. And then we have a question, anonymous questions. Since the decoloniality lenses are structure-based, aren't the how-to-dos too individual-based? Maybe more clearly, what could be a structural way to address the problem of colonialism?
Great question, and I invite you to also provide some answers, audience members. And I think that's it's a great point. Now I'm thinking how actually I might reframe that slide for future talks, but because the idea with the slide is to think about what can we do as individuals, right? So then I end up with individual things that we can do as individuals. But I was trying to make the link to what we do as individuals is, okay, some of them are actually just individual, like how you act as a chair or how you cite or whatever. But a lot of them are about how you try to impact your institutions, the institution that you're in. And that's what will have a bigger impact. So I'm thinking like how structural things that can have an impact can be like pushing for open access, for example, like against the publishing industry is like a structural way to make, because there are so many structural problems like journal articles not being too expensive for universities in the global south to even afford. Or things like we were recently invited to write a handbook on decolonizing economics, but the handbooks cost £200. So it's like impossible for, if we're going to have lots of global south scholars contributing, they can't even buy it, right? It's so expensive. I think, thinking about ways that we can change the publishing industry, universities. I mean, the whole neoliberal university where students pay for their education is already very exclusive. In the UK, it's exclusive already at the high school level because the students that enter elite universities are very often privately schooled. So it's such a big structural problem that becomes very difficult to come up with a solution. Like, what can I personally do about it? What can you personally do about it? Other than like, engaging in politics and either engaging with party politics or some other forms of activism that are maybe more anti-politics. In terms of academia more generally, I think like the student movement is kind of a structural movement as well that doesn't sort of individualize the problems, but creates a challenge to the university that they need to react to in a structural way. Although they haven't, I don't know, actually, I'd be interested to hear how it's going in Germany, but in the UK, I wouldn't say there have been massive gains in terms of the student movement. There have been like some gains that are, it depends what a big gain is, but there are some more electives in a lot of the economics departments, mainstream economics departments. More of them have like history of thought electives, for example, or more emphasis on electives that are on inequality and things like that, which is an improvement. But it's not like really actually a structural change. But that's an avenue to continue to engage with this kind of bigger solutions.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting question and for the answer. Also to everyone here, please, I would like to encourage you to post your questions also live if you want to. And we have one question by Johannes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I think it's really interesting, all those dependencies and power structures, and also all the stuff that's basically left out unsaid in mainstream economics. And one thing I'm not so sure about yet is this. It felt to me like you're quite criticizing Enlightenment as a whole concept, and I would personally say that maybe it obviously needs to be updated, and there have been problematic scholars as well within it. But maybe that's something we shouldn't throw out from my perspective, but rather update and with views of Enlightenment, which I think are not just rationalistic, but maybe also humanistic values. I think those give us good reasons to change economics as well and to look to the global south for answers, for example. Would you agree with that, or do you think that Enlightenment was kind of wrong as a whole and we should leave it behind us?
That's a great question. It's a great question because, so I can clarify. So I think there are some things that are associated with that we associate with the Enlightenment that are presented as associated with the Enlightenment that are that we can repurpose and rethink, like for example, rationality or objectivity. Objectivity, for example, a lot of feminist economists have written about how it's not that we don't want to be objective when we criticize the objectivity of the mainstream. It's that we think that we can be more objective if we also include other ways of theorizing about the same issue, so that we can include more perspectives and be explicit about where we're theorizing from. That actually is a more objective way of doing social science than pretending that there is no vantage point that someone theorizes about. So that's, I guess, one aspect of the Enlightenment that you could say, oh, okay, it's when you criticize the neutrality or rationality, objectivity, it's not that we want to be irrational or biased or sloppy, or it's that we need to think differently about these things. And rationality is another thing that, yeah, there are like different ways of being rational other than homo economicus and stuff. But humanistic values, I think it's another thing that I think is, of course, important. But I think the Enlightenment, although it claims to be about humanistic values, a lot of the scholars that were engaged in the Enlightenment were racist, and they were like, yes, for freedom, and oh, freedom for all, but it was actually not for all. It was, totally fine with colonialism and whatever. So I mean, it's associated with the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment itself was actually very violent and racist. So in that sense, I'm like, I don't know if I would say that, oh, we should rescue these ideas from the people into account. But that's not to say that I should think how we can be humanistic. Maybe it's a question of strategy, that if we want to kind of engage with a language that people recognize, then maybe it's a strategic thing to not like, because it is, I do think that people often have a knee-jerk reaction against people that criticize the Enlightenment, because they think, oh, it's like, oh, we now need to go back to live as farmers and we're against technology or something like that. Which I think isn't, most people that criticize the Enlightenment aren't criticizing that, or aren't suggesting that. They're just saying, oh, we need to actually have a more just way of looking at the world that takes into account the injustices that were legitimized during the Enlightenment, like colonialism or racism. So I don't know, maybe I'm disagreeing. I don't know if I'm agreeing or disagreeing here, but those are my thoughts on that issue.
Okay, thank you for this question, Johannes. We had a raised hand by Bob. I don't know if you can unmute him, Johannes. Yeah, just unmute him, and you can post your question live.
We can't hear you yet, but you can just talk away if you want.
Hi, I think you can hear me now. Is that fine? I just wrote my question, actually. I typed it in, but I can also read it out loud. I had a few problems with understanding of the presentation. First, you mentioned the Rittenhouse trial. And as I studied law before, I changed to economics. I can see that his presence at the protest might itself have racist motives, but the trial itself was mostly about self-defense and gun laws. I mean, as far as I know, the 3 victims were all white and all white males. One had also a gun. I only know of 2 deaths. And if I look at the perspective from German law, beside the gun thing, I think he even might have gone free here as well, even if he has a completely not racist judge. I don't see how the law there is racist, as there were no Black people involved besides the topic of the demonstration itself. And secondly, you wrote about potentially racist everyday academic practices. Could you bring an example? Because I get that in England, the system is pretty unjust because of the high private cost you have to study, to go to better universities and so on. But in Germany, where it's not like that, where you don't have to pay that much or any tuition, and you get state-funded money and everything, where is like the racist everyday academic practices that we can or should change?
Thank you. I think starting with the last one, it's a very good question. And I think I can send a blog post on this that I wrote a year ago, I think, where there's so much research on how academia is extremely exclusive and racist and sexist. For example, like there's a lot more research on women economists and then Black economists, but also I think that's because there's a lot more women economists than Black economists. But there is research on both in terms of like being the likelihood of being cited, for example, much less likely if you're from if you're a woman than a man, or hiring practices, for example. There's quite a lot of research on that in terms of both being both gender and race perspectives, and the accomplishments that you need are much higher if you're from a marginalized identity. The same with promotion. A lot of this research comes from the US, actually. They're much more ahead in terms of like researching their institutional practices and how they prioritize some identities over others. In the UK, I think there's I guess it's similar with the Rittenhouse thing that I get numbers wrong sometimes. So maybe I shouldn't say the number of Black professors, but there's like around 10, I would say. But it's probably not 10 exactly, but there's extremely few, right? Because it's just so difficult. So it's like in the US literature, they call it like the leaky pipeline. It's harder to get into a PhD program. You're less likely, the mentoring you get is less. You face a hostile environment. I mean, it's like microaggressions and all this kinds of stuff. I guess it's also a part of what you called everyday racism. I don't know the situation in Germany, but for me, because I came from development studies before, and I didn't, I mean, of course, racism and sexism is everywhere, but it wasn't that prevalent for me. When I came into economics for my PhD, it was like mind blowing how racist it was. I could like see with my non-white friends, and sexist. It's like constantly in the way that people interrupt you or who gets to speak, who is listened to. And so there's that extra pressure that people need to face throughout their career, obviously, which leads a lot of people to drop out, even at the PhD stage. Well, you see even in undergraduate, like women and minorities tend to drop out at a higher rate than others in undergraduate, and then fewer go on to masters, and then fewer go on to PhDs, and then fewer go on to actually academia. So this is the leaky pipeline that just, where sometimes it's the choice, and sometimes it's the structural barrier that, oh, you didn't get a job, you didn't get an interview, you didn't get tenure. And it's like, and there's so many, and there's also research on like if a woman co-authors with the man, then often the man gets credit for it rather than the woman. Like for example, in promotion processes in the US, it was like, oh, if a woman co-authored with a man, it wouldn't count as much for her in her promotion, which is like ridiculous. It's like so extremely sexist, but it happens all the time in like a systematic way, so that you can actually, there are like academic articles that demonstrate this. So those are some examples of everyday sexism and racism. And that, I guess, is something also that comes back to the question earlier about structural solutions, something that we can think about. How do we prevent those racist practices, which is hard, but and I think there's also some research on like how, because now the big thing in vogue is like having diversity training and stuff like that, which seems to not work much, because I guess it's also an individualized approach. So the question is, how do we actually challenge these things in a structural way, which I don't know if I have answers to. And then in terms of Rittenhouse, I mean, I think, I don't know if, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if like how that trial would have played out in Germany or in any other countries. But my understanding from the debates and like what I read in the news, maybe I shouldn't have brought it up, but is that a lot of activists and policymakers in the US are seeing this as an extremely racist outcome of someone who went to a Black Lives Matter protest and with a gun and murdered 2 people and didn't face any consequences for it. And that is, and the reason I brought it up was because some people were saying, oh, it's because of that individual judge. But I think it's the legal system, right? But I didn't mean to really make as a law expert, make a claim about whether it's legally correct or not. But I think it's an outcome of the legal system rather than the judge itself. But sorry if I said the wrong things about the number of deaths and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer and also for the question. You want to add something, Bob?
Yeah, I would like continue because every example that you brought in were mostly like things that we can see pretty much in every field, like in every job, we have the same problems. Like it's not an academic specific thing. I thought you had maybe examples for an academic specific thing, because yeah, that you have more men in higher positions and that's PhDs and everything, but you kind of have that problem in every field. And I think, for example, in Germany, if you look, for example, at the Max Planck University, we have disproportionate, like, let's say, numbers that go into the other direction. For example, in the male-female thing, we have way more female students. I think over 50% of the people in Germany between 30 and 34 that have a higher education are female. I think men are around, for 2015, was the last number, we're around 42%, and females are like most of the other parts. So isn't it changing already? Because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it were more males, but now we have like a disproportionate bigger female part. Shouldn't, like, because PhDs and other things take long to achieve, shouldn't like the change in the number of students in total change the number of female professors, female colleagues, to speak, in the future? Like, shouldn't we see these changes in the numbers, but not now, maybe in 10 years when these people have a career that is 10, 15 years old?
That's a really good question as well. And I think maybe there's 2 parts to it that I'll answer. I think that, first of all, I guess one issue is like the differences in fields, right? And differences academia versus other parts of the world. Is it just that the world is sexist and racist and academia is just a reflection of that? And, it's just how it is. So we can't really do anything about that. We need to change the society needs to change, and then the economics field can change. So I think that there are massive differences in terms of, and then again, I should have maybe done some research on the German system before coming to this talk, because all the research that I have is on the UK and the US. But there we see that the economics field is like much less diverse than the other social sciences, but not only the other social sciences, also the natural sciences. It's like an extremely, like the most hierarchical field. And then another thing is like this, the most hierarchical also in terms of like being very networky, like Ivy Leagues hire Ivy Leagues kind of thing, which you don't have as much in anthropology and sociology. You could get a job at Harvard as a sociologist or anthropologist without coming from an Ivy League, which is much harder as an economist. So the field of economics is much more hierarchical. In a few different ways. And then the other thing is that, so the sciences, they actually had a lot of policies that were about, they were mostly about getting more women because they had a very serious issue of being very male. and they changed drastically the past decades, like since the 70s or 80s. There's been a huge shift towards much more equal gender balance. I don't know about the racial balance. And the softer social sciences are generally a bit more diverse than economics. So it's strange how economics is just like, I mean, I don't know how, it's hard to compare economics to the world generally, because of course the world generally is also unequal. But if you just look at the different fields, now I'm again speaking UK and US, there is a problem in economics that isn't just a reflection of society. It's something that is about the field itself. Of course, so given that it is something that is, even if it were just a part of society, it's still something that the field should do something about, right? So then the question is like, why is it that economics is so much worse than the other fields? And then to your point about like the now women are coming in, now people of color are coming in, shouldn't we see a change in the future? I think that's what a lot of people were hoping. But I was just looking at so again, UK example. But in the UK, it's like literally the number of the women students in undergraduate economics degrees is flat the past like 3 decades. So there's no like natural sort of progression towards improvement in the economics field in the UK again now. But yeah, so I mean, I'm glad to hear that it seems to be the case in Max Planck. I think that's great, and I know that there are like really good examples. Like my colleagues in China and India talk about like that's like economics is not a male field, like per definition. In India and China, women have much more space. So it's not a universal thing, right? But in the UK and the US, where many of the top economics departments are, that is, it's something that the field still has to reckon with.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we're somehow leaving the topic of decolonizing here. Bob, if it's not, maybe we can leave this sexism discussion a little bit aside and turn again to the decolonizing point, if that's okay for you, or do you still want to add something, Bob?
I just wanted to like be nice to our guest here and take some UK data, because we always talk about diversity, for example, in economics, but I just looked at your data, like at the British data, and yeah, you have a real great misbalance in the economic field, but you have a way bigger misbalance, for example, in the psychology field. Like we speak of 80 to 85% women in that field. Like, isn't it like just because of the field, because of the way it's taught? Like, should we change psychology too, so more male students will take it? Because like in the UK, you have a huge unbalance in these fields between genders. And my question is, it's the same topic with decolonization and colored people and everything, because do we have the data? I mean, I think in the UK you have 3.5, maybe 4% colored people. Like, how far can we go there, and how much is maybe ideology? How much is maybe things we just want to see in these topics? Because we don't care about not having enough male students in certain fields. It just doesn't matter. We just look the other way around on fields that might be not appealing to women, while we don't care about fields that are not appealing to men. And the same maybe goes for the other two topics as well.
Thank you. I think that's a good question. And I think that's something that's often brought up in like typical FT FT articles about women in economics. It's like, oh, but women don't want to study economics, right? Why should we try? We want to, why should we even, try to change the field when women don't like math, So I think that is one issue, is like, okay, do women just not want to be in economics? Is that really the case? Is a very valid question. I think from what I've seen, women are interested in economics, maybe not in terms of like, it depends on how they're exposed to it, right? And who they are, who teaches them. If they see it as a completely male-dominated field, they might feel excluded and not like it, they don't see themselves in economists. So that's one way of thinking about it. But then the other thing is that, okay, if it's really true that women don't want to be in economics, yeah, we shouldn't force anyone to be in economics. But the problem is if there's and same with men, right? We shouldn't force men to study. I think you said it was psychology. If they don't want to, it's not like we have to have equality everywhere. If people choose differently, that's fine. But the problem is that there is sexism and racism, right, documented through empirical work that shows how women are discriminated against throughout their careers in economics. And that is something that when it's a structural problem, then I think that is something we have to do something about. And that's something that makes, forces women and people of color out of the profession. If it's the case that it's a structural problem, that men are facing structural issues in other fields that are female dominated, that's also something we have to tackle, because that's something that excludes people that would want to be there, but that don't, that are excluded for structural reasons. So I think that's the important thing that I would think about in terms of the diversity aspect. Like, are people structurally excluded, or are they choosing to not be a part of the field? Of course, lots of women, totally fine if women want to study sociology. I myself was alienated by economics when I first entered the economics field as an undergraduate. I went to development studies instead. I found it much more relatable. So it's not like it's up to women to change. But what I think do need to, if we do want diversity, or not just if we want diversity, we want just justice, right? We don't want people to face discrimination in anywhere. So one thing is like the social justice aspect. We need to tackle structural discrimination. And the other aspect is that it actually would, I think it would improve the field as well, to have more diversity. Yeah. But I guess this is, I mean, I think that it's true what Sarah is saying, that, oh, okay, is this really about decolonization? But I do think it is also about that the two are quite interlinked in terms of the structural exclusions that happen in the field impact women and minorities and scholars from the Global South. And they're interlinked in many ways, but we can also talk about how they're separate, I guess. I think diversity is important for decolonization, but it's not sufficient. Yeah, necessary but not sufficient. But thank you for all these questions.
Yeah, thank you for the question and also for the great answer. We again have a comment, an anonymous comment, who says thank you for the talk and for your answers. I think we're slowly coming to an end because there are no more questions. I myself have another questions also for our group. I don't know how to pose this question. I don't want to say something, but yeah, we're very, very happy to have you here. But is it also a problem that we as a group from the Global North asked someone from the Global North to talk about decolonizing? I mean, should we have asked someone else, or and also how can we decolonize our group? Maybe you have some suggestions for us, and also how can we decolonize also our lecture series, or have you something you can recommend to us as a student group?
Great question. I think that, I mean, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have invited me. No, I mean, I think that it's great. I think it would be great. And as a way to decolonize is to give scholars in the Global South a platform to speak and to share their ideas. That is a way that the group can also become more, anti-colonial, right? And Zoom kind of gives that possibility. It becomes much easier. You don't have to pay for all the travel and visa costs. So I think that is something that would be really important. In terms of, I mean, I think about it a lot, and we talk about it a lot in Decon, like, what is our role in the global North? People in the global North, like, what is our role in decolonizing? Do we have a role? Should we just actually shut up and let people in the global South do the job? So I think that I mean, we're still figuring out what is the best way without taking up all this, taking actually up space ourselves from people in the global South. I think part of some of the thoughts I have on it is that we have to do something. It can't just be on the people in the global South to talk about this. Just like, it's not just on women to challenge the patriarchy. Men also have to do that. So I think as long as people in the global North are trying to create space for people in the global South, then that is allyship, right? To kind of push the decolonization agenda forward, which I don't think is just a global South question. It's not just a question of the global South. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that inviting someone from the global South, I mean, you have to invite someone for the topic that you want them to speak on, right? There's lots of people in the global South, just like in the global North, that are completely mainstream and that will have nothing critical to say about decolonizing, or maybe not even know about the debates, because it's a very marginal debate. I mean, lots of people just don't know about it. So I don't think this comes back to the diversity decolonization question about, like, positionality is important, diversity is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. So if you had, you could have a lecture series with only people from the global South, that's super colonial, because there are, the universities in the global South are shaped and constrained by the economics field as well, and often to a much larger degree than some universities in the global North that have, where it's less costly to be an activist or to go kind of to engage with heterodox theories and stuff. So yeah, but I can think about some names if you are thinking of inviting someone from the global South. I know a few people, but the problem is also that people in the global South, a lot of scholars in the global South are extremely busy and overworked because of the way that the system is and the university systems function in the world. I mean, people in the global North are super overworked too, but it's worse in the global South. But yeah, I think that would be great to invite some scholars working on decolonizing from the global South, or not necessarily working on decolonizing, but working from non-global North perspectives. Yeah. So that's something kind of concrete, I guess, that the group can do. Other things that the group can do, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what kind of activities you're doing generally. I know and how big you are. I know the Rethinking Economics in the UK are doing quite a lot on decolonizing and diversity these days, but they have an office with people employed and stuff. So they are releasing a book that's coming out in a couple of months, with edited book with lots of contributions about how to decolonize and diversify and democratize 3Ds economics. So I guess, there are different ways that you can create a platform for these kinds of debates, in terms of publications or lecture series or blog series or whatever. And there's also different ways that you as a group can grow to try to think about your own practices and learn yourself, right? which maybe have to do more with your reading groups that you were talking about, or I guess it also has to do with the lecture series that you learn, and then draw on those insights from the lectures in your work as well. And also, I guess, who you engage with in the university, and what kind of changes you try to make in the university itself. Have a look at, who are your lecturers, who are your who's running the university, how are they running it, and maybe that could be a part of like having decolonizing the university as a part of the kind of student movement as a whole would probably strengthen the movement and make it more anti-colonial as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that's a nice last words for our lecture series today. I would just like to invite everyone to join us next week again. The lecture will be in German next week, and it will be about post-development and when we will. Yeah, and now I wish everyone a nice evening, and yeah, we can stop the recording now.